Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing an alternate history video, something we don't do on this channel very often, and taking a look at the hypothetical of what the 2022 Senate elections would look like if Donald Trump was still in office. Because Donald Trump actually wins the election, there's a number of factors that are going to be a lot different than in our timeline, so we'll take a look at those in just a second. We'll also take a look at the 2022 Senate map as a whole and talk about how those 2020 Senate races would have went if Donald Trump had actually won the White House back in 2020. But before we get into all that, please consider liking this video down below if you enjoy and subscribing to the channel if you're new. So anyway, let's get straight into it. So this is the 2020 map if Donald Trump wins the White House. Now this map takes the least amount of leaps in logic, essentially, to make possible. Donald Trump narrowly wins Arizona, narrowly wins Georgia, narrowly wins Wisconsin, and narrowly wins Pennsylvania. Those are the four closest states of the 2020 election cycle. And if we take a look back at the 2020 map, Donald Trump only lost the state of Georgia by 0.2%, Arizona by 0.3%, Wisconsin by 0.6%, and of course Pennsylvania by 1.2%. Now Pennsylvania is obviously the biggest leap, but in this hypothetical, Donald Trump is able to pull off an extremely narrow victory in the Keystone State, giving him the White House. Now, if Donald Trump had won the 2020 election, he probably also would have carried some Republicans over with him. If Donald Trump had won Georgia, for instance, he likely would have carried David Perdue over the runoff threshold, which would mean that David Perdue would not be going off to a runoff election with Jon Ossoff that he would later lose. Now, what's interesting about this race is that David Perdue beat Jon Ossoff by 1.8%, nearly 2 percentage points, but despite that, he ended up losing by 1.4. So in this hypothetical, David Perdue avoids the runoff and ends up winning this Senate seat outright in November. As for Raphael Warnock, the same results happen. They go to a runoff. Raphael Warnock wins the runoff, just like he does in our timeline, by about 2 points or so. So basically the same results in the runoff elections, except there's only one rather than two. So that would put the Senate currently at 45 for the Democrats and 44 for the Republicans. At the end, we'll kind of change this total because this is accounting for the fact that David Perdue lost, which in our timeline he did, but in this timeline he doesn't. So before we categorize these individual races, let's take a look back at the Donald Trump approval rating, because there's a number of factors that would affect this. Of course, Donald Trump's disapproval rating shot up as he was leaving office, but because Donald Trump wins 2020, there is no election denial, there's no January 6th, any of that stuff, so that really doesn't factor into the equation. So you'd really have to kind of look at Donald Trump's approval rating really before the election, right around where he was and throughout his term. You have to imagine he's probably underwater anywhere from 15 to 10 points throughout his second term. Now, gas prices and things being the way they are currently, those probably would have stayed the same. Roughly, if Donald Trump was in office, there would be some differences with Afghanistan, things like that. So it's very tough to actually categorize where Trump's approval rating would be as of right now. But it would probably be, if we had to guess for this hypothetical, around his average, which according to FiveThirtyEight is about 10 or 11 points underwater. So that's where he would be during the 2022 midterms. Roe v. Wade still would probably be overturned, given that that really wasn't something that Donald Trump had a part in. That was just the Supreme Court going about its business. So if that all stays the same, then I think the Republicans would take an extra hit going into this midterm. So first, we'll start off with the state of Nevada and make our way east across the country, kind of filling in these hypothetical matchups. Now, all of the candidates are going to be the same in all of these races. We have to it would be too much of a stretch to say certain candidates would run or wouldn't run in this situation. Let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, all of the candidates and matchups are exactly the same. So in Nevada, you have Catherine Cortez Masto going up against Adam Laxalt. Now, if we go back to the 2018 midterm elections, which was also sort of a blue wave year, Adam Laxalt actually outperformed incumbent Dean Heller. Dean Heller lost by 5 points as an incumbent Republican senator in Nevada. Adam Laxalt only lost to Steve Sisolak by about 4.1% as a non-incumbent running for the governorship. So Adam Laxalt is objectively a stronger candidate than even incumbent Dean Heller. And given this midterm environment, he likely would lose, but I think he'd keep the margin at about 5 points or so. Nevada is a state that is trending more Republican, but Donald Trump being in office would obviously hurt Republicans overall. So I think Nevada would go to Catherine Cortez Masto by about 5 points or so. Moving on down to Arizona, Mark Kelly is a pretty strong incumbent. He won back in 2020 by about 2.4%, I believe. That wouldn't really change so much in our hypothetical. If Donald Trump had won Arizona in our matchup, then I think that Mark Kelly probably would have won by a smaller margin, given the fact that Republicans would have done slightly better. But nonetheless, I think Mark Kelly would still hold on to this seat pretty easily. Blake Masters, as of right now, is running a pretty decent campaign. Again, he was running pretty right-wing in the primary, especially on social issues. He sort of moderated his campaign. I think he would definitely do the same in this timeline, but ultimately, I think he'd lose to Mark Kelly by about 3.5 to 4 points if 2022 had Donald Trump in the White House. Moving on up to the state of Iowa, Chuck Grassley is very entrenched in Iowa politics. Last time around in 2016, he won his re-election to the Senate by about 25 points or so. Even given the midterm environment and given the fact that Chuck Grassley is older and the nation is more polarized, I still think he'd end up winning this Senate race by about 8 to 10 points. I think it would be a lot closer given the national environment and given, again, how polarized the country is, but I still think Chuck Grassley would be an incredibly strong incumbent. And Iowa is a state that overall is trending toward the Republicans. Even in 2020, which was a year where Republicans lost the popular vote by nearly 5 percentage points, Donald Trump still won the state of Iowa by about 8 points. That's despite the national environment being about D plus 4.5. So that just goes to show you the trends that are going on in the Midwest and how even during a blue wave with a strong incumbent, I think Chuck Grassley would be able to hold on. Moving on up to Wisconsin. Wisconsin would be a good pickup opportunity, I think, for the Democrats. Ron Johnson is not exactly popular. I think one of the reasons why he's doing so well now this year is because he's an incumbent Republican running in a year which is expected to be better for Republicans than at least 2020 was. And given how close Wisconsin was back in 2020, Ron Johnson's in a good position to win re-election in our timeline. But in this timeline, I think things are very different. Donald Trump is still in the White House. The Republicans are probably extremely unpopular, especially given the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which I think would supercharge Democratic voters in this midterm environment. Trump would try to get the Republican base energized, but like 2018, I think it mostly wouldn't work out. And the Senate map that Republicans are dealing with in 2022 is a lot more difficult for them. They're basically trying to defeat a lot of incumbents in a lot of these swing states that already have the advantage of a strong national environment. Wisconsin's one of the few states where Republicans actually have an incumbent. But in this situation, I think Mandela Barnes would probably end up winning this race by about 3 points. I think Ron Johnson would do better than expected, especially in the WOW counties. But I think the national environment overall would put Barnes over the top, especially given the fact that Ron Johnson doesn't exactly have high favorables, and neither does Donald Trump in this timeline. Moving on over to the state of Ohio. This is a very interesting state because Ohio, even in our timeline, Republicans aren't exactly doing that great in the state. Currently, Republican nominee J.D. Vance is only pulling ahead, depending on what aggregate you look at. But if we average them all together, he's pulling ahead by about 1.5 percentage points. FiveThirtyEight has Tim Ryan up by a point. J.D. Vance is up by 3.7, 1.4. Now, part of this, of course, is due to the national environment. So in this situation, J.D. Vance is still the nominee. Tim Ryan is still the Democratic nominee. I think this race would be pretty close, especially given the fact that back in 2018, Sherrod Brown was able to hold this seat by a pretty large margin, a likely margin, in a state that Donald Trump had won by over 8 points 2 years earlier. So I think while the national environment would be strong for the Democrats, I still think Republicans would hold on to the state of Ohio by about 2 points, 2.5 points or so. I think Tim Ryan's a very strong candidate, but I think at this point, Ohio has become too much of a red state to realistically flip. And again, there's a number of factors in this timeline that aren't the case in our current timeline. Again, January 6th, things like that aren't really there to energize the Democratic base as much. But of course, you also have Roe v. Wade, which would get Democratic voters supercharged in this sort of environment. So I still think Ohio would go to the Republicans, but it would be very close and hard fought. I think Donald Trump going to the state of Ohio, campaigning for Vance, would probably be just enough to get Vance over the finish line, plus the fact that Ohio is a really red state, but I think it would be close either way. Moving on up to the state of New Hampshire, I think Maggie Hassan, even though she won her last election by a pretty narrow margin. And when I mean narrow, I mean by just about 1,000 votes or so. I think the national environment would be incredibly favorable to her in this situation. I think I could easily see Hassan winning by about 7 or 8 points against whoever the Republican nominee is. Maybe even more, perhaps, given the national environment. But I would put that as likely Democratic right now. Moving on down to the state of Pennsylvania. Now, this is a state that Republicans aren't even guaranteed to win in this cycle, and they're certainly struggling, to say the least, in both the governor and Senate races. But in this timeline, Donald Trump is the president. Dr. Oz is still the Republican nominee. John Fetterman is the Democratic nominee. I think John Fetterman would win this race pretty easily. I think Dr. Oz, if he is to win in November, will mainly be due to the national environment, Biden's disapproval rating, and of course, John Fetterman himself as a candidate. But in this timeline, I think Fetterman could probably win this race by about 6 to 7 points. Pennsylvania is much more of a blue state in non-presidential years, and if we take a look back at the results in Pennsylvania back in 2018, Bob Casey was able to win. Again, he's a very popular incumbent. He was able to win by about 13 points in the state of Pennsylvania. I think personally, John Fetterman would not be able to do this well. Dr. Oz would certainly do better than Lou Barletta, given the fact that, of course, I think Barletta really was hurt by the fact that Bob Casey was so popular, Trump was so unpopular, and he really didn't do the best to campaign for this seat to begin with. So I think Dr. Oz would probably lose by about 7 points or so. I could easily see a situation, where he gets about 45% of the vote. John Fetterman gets about 51, 52, and then the rest kind of go to third parties. So that's what I would see happening in Pennsylvania in this sort of situation. Moving on down to the state of North Carolina. Now, this one is very interesting because North Carolina is a very inelastic state when it comes to voting patterns. It is always almost a lean Republican state in any year. And in 2018, Republicans narrowly won the House popular vote by like 0.1% or something ridiculously close. So, North Carolina is a state that tends to go blue in some statewide offices. We see that with Attorney General, Secretary of State, and of course, Governor. I think, Sherry Beasley, again, I don't think she's the strongest Democratic nominee. Ted Budd, I think, did have a lot of things going for him. But I think just based on the national environment and given the fact that it's possible that in 2018, Democrats could have picked up a Senate race here if North Carolina had a Senate race, I think the Democrats would narrowly win the state of North Carolina. And when I mean narrowly, I mean by about 0.5% or something like that. North Carolina is always incredibly close. But I think Sherry Beasley in this situation would get black turnout just high enough and white liberal turnout just high enough in the urban areas to push her over the top. Moving on down to the state of Georgia, Raphael Warnock, again in our timeline, Raphael Warnock won by a pretty sizable margin in the runoff elections. If we take a look back at the Senate races in Georgia, technically in the 2021 runoff, he won by about 2 points, despite the fact that before the runoff election, Republicans, if you add up all of the Republican votes, actually won the popular vote narrowly. Raphael Warnock, I think, would win by an even larger margin than he did in this runoff election. I could very well see a situation where Raphael Warnock wins by about 3.5 to 4 points even. And this would make for a very interesting governor's race as well, because I think if the national environment was so hostile to Republicans, it's very likely that at this point, Brian Kemp would actually be polling in the negative right now. So it would make for a very interesting dynamic. But nonetheless, Georgia, I think, would go to the Democrats by a lean margin. Finally, we go on down to Florida. Florida is a state that's been trending Republican, especially since 2016. Marco Rubio is the incumbent senator. He's a strong incumbent. I think the polls would be decently closer, but I ultimately think at the end of the day that Marco Rubio would probably end up winning this race by about 7 points or so. Florida is a state trending to the right. Again, if we go back to the 2020 results, Florida was one of the few states that actually moved to the right in the country overall, and Donald Trump won an outright majority in the state with 51.2%. I think his strength among Latinos, Marco Rubio's that is, would incredibly be a powerful asset in his reelection, and ultimately he would win by a likely margin. So anyway, that's it for today's video, guys. Democrats would have 52 seats in the Senate, not 53. Again, we have to account for the fact that David Perdue would win outright back in 2020. This would give the Democrats a 52 to 48 majority in the Senate. Obviously, Democrats would also win the House. They never would have lost the House. The gains that the Republicans made in 2020, probably some of those would go by the wayside. Democrats would still hold the House. probably this time by a stronger margin than they do already. So anyway, guys, that's it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed this hypothetical scenario. We're going to get into full gear covering a lot of these general elections coming up for the midterm, so stay tuned for that. We're going to be uploading a lot more frequently on this channel, so please, if you enjoy these videos and you haven't subscribed already, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification, and like this video down below if you enjoyed. Again, thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.